Glad for the support of China in this. The next speaker is Pam Bjornson, who's Director General Knowledge Management at the National Research Council Knowledge Management Group in Canada. I think it's about a year and a half ago, Pam organized a data summit in Ottawa, which I was speaking at, which I think showed me how far Canada had actually come in what seemed to be quite a short time. And one of the keynote speakers there was also Chad Graham, who's somewhere in the audience. I think I can see him up the back there. But Pam has been very influential in taking this forward in Canada. So over to you, Pam.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come today. I have to say the hat that I have on today is as chair of the Research Data Canada group. I'm going to slide through very quickly just a bit of background about Research Data Canada, then a little bit about the Canadian perspective, and then we'll talk a little bit about RDA and where we see Canada fitting in future with RDA, and some questions that we have for our participation in the Research Data Alliance. And if I mix up RDC and RDA, I'm sure you'll understand, but you might want to wave at me because I'm probably going to do that at some point. As John mentioned, in 2011, the Data Summit Mapping the Canadian Landscape was held. There are some people here in the room who were wonderful speakers, including John, at that conference. We really came out of that with a strong sense of where people wanted to go. From the 160 participants, a report was developed. And I think that we're very, very optimistic because of a number of reasons that I'll talk about, that in this case we are going to see what we talked so much about today, which is adoption and implementation. I won't speak about the 2 or 3 other data-related conferences and efforts over the last 10 years because I do feel optimistic that we are at a tipping point at this point in time. So the vision that came out is not dissimilar from visions that you will have seen in many other fora. I'm not going to go into this. It'll be in the slide deck. But I think that it's really important to say that this is the vision that came out of the summit. So it's a widely held vision that was adopted by a very wide group of stakeholders. The sets of goals were really clustered around a number of things, and I think you will have talked about those at some point, each of these today, including policies, capacity building and education, infrastructure, research culture, funding and sustainability, and standards and interoperability. So Research Data Canada has come an organization that's arisen out of the summit. It's stakeholder driven and supported. It's a voluntary initiative, very wide range of stakeholders involved in it. And it's not operating infrastructure or anything of that nature. It's really to provide a sort of coordination and voice for data in Canada. Current activities, the 5 RDC committees or working groups are the most important part of the organization. Each of them is very action-oriented. I was interested to see that we're almost completely aligned with RDA because each of them has an action plan that they need to accomplish in the next 12 to 18 months. And action is, again, the operative word. And it's in infrastructure, policy, education training, international, and standards. There are a number of other activities, including some upcoming meetings and conferences, which I won't go into. Some of you may have seen this slide. My colleague Walter Stewart, I think, presented this in Copenhagen. But in looking at the sort of 3 pillars of research infrastructure, network, compute, and data, and the kind of ideal situation, and then the situation that we find in Canada today, we're pretty well served by networks. We're pretty well served by computation as well, but the coordination on the data side really has a long ways to go. So the context that we have right now is, I feel, a real emerging approach to national coordination. We have a Digital Infrastructure Leadership Council that's looking to identify some gaps and measures to close those gaps. There's a lot of leadership and collaboration emerging among our research and research infrastructure agencies. We have substantial, and always have had substantial, investments in data production, but there is a growing recognition now that there's a big gap in data stewardship and access. In other words, the investments that we've made, which are huge, are not being realized fully because we don't have the infrastructure, the tools, and the services to support them. So I think I could describe Canada's situation, at least on the data side, as having been almost entirely bottom-up. We certainly have had some substantial funding for production, but in terms of data infrastructure, services, and tools, there has been a real lack of coordination. I will say that the granting councils are working more closely together than ever before on open access issues, that they have recently recommended that work should pursue 2 tracks, one for research publications and one for research results, and I'm very hopeful that this is going to result in some policy initiatives in the near future. There's also strong leadership emerging on data management, led by Dr. Gaffield, who's the president of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and Dr. Gilles Patry, who is president and CEO of the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And although they're taking the lead, they really represent all of the research granting councils. And I like Chad Gaffield's notes because the 3 steps forward that he's been talking about recently in speeches that he's given to university administrators, I think they're not the whole world of what needs to happen, but if these 3 things happened, they would move the world in very interesting ways. And those are guidelines for effective data management plans. This is in collaboration and consultation, but this would come from the councils. Formally describe contributions to digital scholarship. So that's that piece around culture and research culture, and keep current with how other countries are dealing with digital scholarship with a view to learning. And of course, Research Data Alliance is a very big piece of that. I mentioned the Digital Infrastructure Leadership Council. There was a summit last year, and the focus is on the full ecosystem. So I'll say a little bit about Canada and Research Data Alliance. This is considered a very important initiative by key Canadian stakeholders. The question right now, given that if I look at this arrow, I would say we're at the tiny pointy end of the arrow. And so there's a great deal. There are some really key priorities that we need to address. Coordinated national approach being first among them, policies and funding, and a collaborative services infrastructure and skills approach. But underlying all of this is the international collaboration and best practices. So I am very hopeful that we can work closely with the Research Data Alliance because I think it is an underpinning factor for all of the areas that we need to move forward on. Peter was talking this morning about the sort of major nodes and the weak nodes, or the dominant modes and weak nodes. And I think we need to really build that out in Canada to have a much more complex and sustainable system, and one where we're not all recreating the world, where we have some coordinating central factors that can help us out. I had some questions that I put on the slide deck about Research Data Alliance, and I would just go back perhaps to my previous slide and say what Research Data Canada can do is certainly to promote involvement in RDA on the part of researchers, all of the many stakeholder groups that we're involved with. And I know there will be great interest from many of the people working in disciplines that are represented here today. But the country involvement is really a decision for the funding agencies. So I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not going to go through each of these questions. I'm sure some of your own national organizations would be asking the same questions. I think many of these are being answered either in private or in conversations that we've heard in the sessions today. So I think that we're getting more clarity around that. And certainly the desire is there on the part of Canada to work in tandem with these international efforts to ensure that we contribute to them, but also that we benefit from these efforts as well. So I wanted to just close with 2 things. One is my favorite quote, and I think as we hear what's going on around the world, we'll see it evidenced even more. And that's from William Gibson, who said that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And the other thing I wanted to say was, this is one of my favorite bridges in the world. It's the Atlantic Highway in Norway, for those of you who haven't seen it, which goes, I think, for a couple of 100 kilometers pretty much over the ocean and islands. And I thought it was a really nice one because I think it shows the kind of daring that's going into the RDA, the kind of thinking that's going into this organization. And you know, we really are building some bridges between some areas that maybe haven't been explored yet either. So I wish RDA all the best. I look forward to our participation at many levels, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Canada today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Pam. We're going to have to try and answer some of those questions. I think I